Sally.
Hello, welcome to session 203. My name is Sally Roth and I will be serving as the session chair. We have three presenters for this session, Nancy Ross, Vicki Beebe, and each will have about 10 minutes to present the women's ordination movement in the RLDS Church, historical and sociological perspectives. Nancy Ross is an associate professor at the Interdisciplinary Arts and Science Department at Dixie State University, where she has been teaching for 14 years. She is an ordained elder in the Community of Christ and pastor of the Southern Utah congregation. Jacquie Bethel is the daughter of Lois Beebe, currently serving on the board of the Historic Sites Foundation, co-pastor of the Gardena congregation in California. Our third presenter is William D. Moore, who will present RLDS preaching charts, history, and typology. William D. Moore is an associate professor of American material at Boston University, where he holds a joint appointment in the Department of History of Art and Architecture and the American and New England Studies program. He has written and lectured extensively on American folk art, vernacular architecture, and fraternal organizations. He holds a PhD in American Studies from Boston University and an AB in folklore and mythology from Harvard. His most recent book, Shaker Fever, America's 20th Century Fascinations with a Communitarian Sect, was recently published by the University of the Massachusetts Press. Please begin.
Thank you for being here. I am Nancy Ross, and I am presenting on the women's ordination movement in the RLDS Church, historical and sociological perspectives. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors, David Howlett, who was unable to be here, and his undergraduate student, Zoe Cruz, who helped us a great deal on this project. In April 1970, a handful of liberal, reorganized Latter-day Saint faculty members at RLDS church-owned Graceland College, now university, founded Courage, a journal of history, thought, and action. That same month, delegates at the World Conference, the renamed General Conference, discussed a resolution that addressed women's underrepresentation on church committees. The Australian delegation presented an alternative motion that affirmed women's leadership and asked church leadership to clarify its position on women's ordination. Delegates, however, voted to table the resolution. In a Courage editorial later that year, the board identified two significant problems in the church: women's inequality and, quote, a shortage of priesthood manpower. Others also expressed that the full talent of the church was not being employed due to the male-only priesthood. Another advocate, Carolyn Reiser, posed the question, why do women want to be in the priesthood? And provided her own answer. She said, some women involved in the emerging women's rights movement within the church would answer, we don't. And she explained that some women associated the priesthood with authoritarianism and therefore did not wish to join it. During the 1970s and early 1980s, women's ordination was a frequent topic of debate at World Conference. Church leadership continued to state that the barriers to women's ordination were not theological, but, in the words of one First Presidency member, a matter of sociology and tradition. A more conservative faction disagreed, arguing that the male-only priesthood was theologically necessary. RLDS fundamentalist Richard Price, for instance, published Saints at the Crossroads, 1974, which warned readers about women's ordination. Even as conservative RLDS members feared women's ordination, some feminist members left the RLDS church because progress was too slow. Like many mainline Protestant denominations, RLDS women formed their own grassroots feminist advocacy organization, which grew out of meetings of the RLDS Women's Caucus in 1975 and 1976. They called this organization AWARE, a nod to the feminist consciousness raising objectives of their group. AWARE members held women-only gatherings that explored feminist theology, supported local women running for public office, created action plans to advocate for equal pay for women who worked for the church, held conferences that explored more broadly women's issues in religion, and wrote letters expressing their solidarity with excommunicated Mormon feminist Sonia Johnson. Some of the women in AWARE were married to men in prominent RLDS leadership positions. However, many participants were rank and file church women, consistent with how successful ordination movements typically involved a combination of elite and grassroots support. Ultimately, AWARE women not only advocated for women's ordination, but they also practiced non-hierarchical models of leadership described in articles published by Courage. In the early 1980s, the campaign for women's ordination within the RLDS Church had spread throughout the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Canada. For example, women were being called to priesthood in local Australian and New Zealand congregations, but their calls were not approved by the RLDS First Presidency. Frustrated by this, Australian and New Zealand delegates at the 1980 World Conference proposed a resolution authorizing women's ordination in their local jurisdictions, even if it did not happen in the larger RLDS Church. The resolution failed to pass. In 1984, Sharon Welch, a longtime member of AWARE and newly hired assistant professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School, led an AWARE retreat at a Benedictine Abbey in northern Missouri. And by then, RLDS feminists had been advocating for more than a decade for goals that were congruent with the emerging women church groups in the Catholic Church. At the retreat, RLDS women tried to enact this vision, allowing all to participate in the serving of communion, a violation of common RLDS practices in which only priesthoods served the sacrament. Feminist groups in other parts of the church had enacted the same transgressive ritual for several years, including an all-women's congregation in Michigan. Though the church hierarchy had long identified revelation as the best path forward for women's ordination, no such revelation had been forthcoming from the First Presidency until the 1984 World Conference, when church leaders presented the long-awaited document. Some church members were more jubilant. Becky Savage, who was present at the reading of the new revelation that became Section 156 of the Doctrine and Covenants, wrote, "I can confirm the overwhelming stunned quiet that permeated the conference chamber when the document was read to the unordained delegates. The second most prominent emotion was joy, and for many, this elation continued for several months later." Others, however, had more mixed responses. Marlene Kruger, who had worked in the music and women's departments of the church, was overwhelmed and did not want additional church responsibilities. RLDS feminists who'd been exploring the elimination of the patriarchal hierarchy in a women church model had a different critique. And for them, women's ordination felt like a concession instead of a victory. Barbara Higdon, president of Graceland College, reflected on her immediate response years later, wondering if she would accept a call to priesthood with integrity. And archivist Madeline Brunson likewise expressed ambivalence and wrote that she felt depressed that the hierarchical church structure would remain intact. In the 1980s and 90s, clergy women in many denominations struggled to achieve legitimacy and parity with clergymen. Sociological studies tracked the low numbers of clergy women in the early decades of women's ordination and the large pay gaps in career trajectories. By 2018, women in some denominations were being ordained in larger numbers, and in a few cases, the numbers had reached parity with clergy men. And while the 1984 World Conference approved women's ordination, the first ordinations did not happen until November 1985, when 100 ordinations took place, with hundreds following the next year. Susan Score reported that many women faced local opposition, not unlike what took place in other denominations. Yet the growing number of women's ordinations made the denomination stand out among American churches. RLDS priesthood statistics from 1996 show that women made up about 27% of all priesthood in the global church at that time. In comparison, the United Church of Christ had the highest percentage of women clergy of any mainline Protestant church at that time, at 25%, with many mainline Protestant denominations sitting at 10 to 12%. In the 30 years since the first RLDS ordinations in 1985, the social significance of women's ordination came into sharper focus as denominations took women's ordination as a sign of which side a group took in America's culture wars. By the 1990s, America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, had retracted its policies that had allowed for women's ordination as senior pastors. Reflecting on such developments, sociologist Mark Chaves explained that American denominations often utilize women's ordination as a symbolic display to the outside world on their collective position toward liberalism within modernity. To resist gender equality, stated Chaves, was and is to resist that project. While scholars express concern over the numbers of those who left in the wake of women's ordination, this change saved the RLDS Church by allowing many more capable adults to join the ranks of church leadership at the local level and more broadly. Many RLDS women celebrated the victory of the 1984 decision, but others viewed this change as a concession to patriarchal hierarchy rather than a win for true equality. Today, 5 of the members of the Council of 12 Apostles are women, as is one of the 3 members of the First Presidency. Women serve at all levels of leadership throughout the global church. Still, the path to women's ordination was a complex one, with church leaders acknowledging that ordination was a possibility many decades before it became a reality. And while a handful of studies detailed the institutional debate and processes that resulted in women's ordination, far fewer acknowledged the role of grassroots groups like AWARE and ecumenical groups. Ultimately, RLDS church leaders chose to align the church with mainline Protestant norms, rather than siding with evangelically inflected concerns. This further marked a separation from LDS church trends and became an important marker of RLDS identity in the late 20th century. Such actions highlight that there were many more ways than one to be a Latter-day Saint in the late 20th century, as well as more than one mainstream to which an American religious group could aspire. Thank you.
The path to ordination of women in Community of Christ. When we look at church history, we don't often get to read about the actual individuals who were the impetus of a specific movement or cause. When we become aware and engaged in the story of real people who were the movers and shakers at the time, history comes alive. This story is focused on the real life experience of a woman who found herself at the forefront of the women's movement and how it affected Community of Christ. As you read the story of Lois Taylor Beebe, you will find actual letters, notes, conversations, and minutes from gatherings. Some are very difficult to comprehend from a 21st century viewpoint. To say it's critical that we need to have a history of the movement, we also need to include in that history the actual stories of the women who were present at the time. In 1969, Lois and her family moved to Lamoni, where she began working for Graceland College and taking classes. Motivated by her reading and studies, she organized a consciousness-raising group in Lamoni. At the same time, a group of young women from the college also began a consciousness-raising group on campus. Lois wrote, quote, "We supported one another in the same concerns, the desire to be free to develop our potential and to have the same opportunities for sharing that potential with the world as men have had from the beginning of time," end quote. She soon discovered that there were serious repercussions, including families broken apart and a change in relationships. During this same time, there was a group of women meeting together in Independence, calling themselves AWARE, which stood for Awake, Worship, Action, Renewal, and Education. She wrote, quote, "Several of us were concerned about the lack of power roles in the RLDS Church. We began to take the initiative and make open attempts to change the system," end quote. Soon the Lamoni Women's Group and the Independence AWARE Group began to merge in order to share ideas and coordinate a plan to move forward. In a letter to the First Presidency dated October 23rd, 1971, Lois wrote, quote, "For many years, since the first moment as a child when I felt the pull towards some eternal power and felt at the same time a desire to offer my life to the service of the cause we call kingdom, there has been the question, why, Lord, why am I not called to serve thee as my brother? Where is the place of the woman in this contemporary world church? Are we to accept calmly the traditional role, punch and cookies, potluck and bazaars, and 20 friendly visits per month? Do you really believe that we are not worthy to walk with you into that holy of holies, to hear the voice of the Lord in high places, to stand with the servants of God in the temple of God? Who among you have more often taken the servant's role? Where is our consolation? Are we to be forever content with the crumbs from the table of the feast of the high priests? What makes us unworthy? An accident of birth, a misplacement of chromosomes? By an act of God, we have been created female. By the acts of man, we have been delegated inferior. Only man who has created the chains of our bondage can release them and give us the freedom to stand as equal. Is it too much to hope that the church, which professes revelatory leadership, could move in this day towards full personhood for women? When will the moment come when we shall have full opportunity to offer our acceptable offering, our lives, to the service of the kingdom of our Lord? How can I teach my children? How can I honestly perpetuate a tradition which is contrary to the worth and dignity of all humankind? A tradition which says to my daughters, you are woman, you are not wanted. But in the same breath to my son, you are man, you are worthy to serve. It is impossible to write in a few words the emotions and concerns of a lifetime. And I realize it is also impossible for you who have not lived through these concerns to sense how very deep-seated and vital they are. There have been many times in my own life when I have cursed my very creation as woman and asked my Lord in bitter tones, if you have created me woman, second-class servant citizen, why have you also planted restless stirrings in my heart and desires for that which cannot be mine? My Lord has not answered my question. Perhaps he has left that answering to you. If ye have desires to serve, ye are called. Is there limitation to this statement? We, the women of the church, are bound by you, the men of the priesthood. Our lives and futures await your pleasure. We are not free to act, but must consciously play the role that you define for us. We are concerned what role you are planning for us in the future of this church, end quote. This letter was also directed to Marjorie Troe, Women's Ministry Consultant, and J. Nelson W. Batter, Lamoni State President. This letter represents not only her personal concerns, but also the concerns of many of the women of that time. After this letter in 1971, movement and changes began slowly but steadily to occur. In 1972, the women's group put together a resolution to be presented at World Conference. This resolution was brought before the Lamoni State Conference for approval, as well as other conferences in the United States, in order to ensure that this resolution would be brought before World Conference in April 1972. When Lois presented this resolution, there was chaos in the meeting. Quote, when I presented this mildly stated resolution to the Lamoni State Conference, both men and women jumped up to shout their disagreement. One young man who was a student in the sociology class that I taught at Graceland College stood, turned around to face me and pointed his finger. You will be responsible for the breakup of families and increasing the crime rates as children will be left on the streets. And to my ultimate shock, a woman member of the congregation which I had been attending stood, pointed at me and shouted, you are an abomination in the sight of God. We had been expecting disagreement, but had never anticipated the kind of violence that faced us in the chamber of faith. I was literally shouted out of the sanctuary. And with my sisters in struggle, we left the chamber in tears of sorrow. As I recall that infamous day, the most distressing recollection was that those in charge, Apostle Don Lentz and Stake President Nelson Batter, did nothing to calm the waters, and by their silence gave support to the violent reactions against us. This thought was hardly fathomable, that as ministers of the church, they allowed anger to erupt beyond comprehension in the congregation for which they were responsible, end quote. Fortunately, at the Portland District Conference, Lucille Oliver presented the same resolution and it passed. It became World Conference Resolution 116. This resolution later passed at World Conference. During World Conference in 1976, the women were planning a social informational meeting. When they asked for a room to gather in, they were denied. They then secured a location at Palmer Junior High School. They asked permission to put up notices on the auditorium bulletin boards and print the invitation in the conference bulletin. Again, denied. So being very resourceful, they put up posters in all the women's bathrooms in the auditorium. There's one behind me. I know you can't see it very well, but it was a poster advertising their meeting. At least 100 women were present at that meeting. The gathering was interrupted by priesthood and protesters shouting harsh and violent words, but since they were on private property and had no jurisdiction, the people were asked to leave, which they did. It took until 1984 for Doctrine and Covenants 156 to come before the conference. Do not wonder that some women of the church are being called to priesthood responsibilities. During the time between 1972 and 1984 World Conference, we lost many talented, gifted, and educated women who became discouraged. The full story of Lois Braby's personal experience toward the inclusion of women in the priesthood, there were many other roadblocks and mountains to climb in achieving the satisfaction of being in the conference chamber that approved women in the priesthood, now known as Section 156 in the Doctrine and Covenants. In closing, Lois reminds us, quote, "This love and justice was and continues to be the hope of all those battered and scarred women and men who struggle to see this vision of justice personified in the lives of all members of our sacred community," end quote.
Elders and missionaries of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, frequently referred to as the RLDS, regularly used preaching charts to visually augment oral evangelism during the final decades of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. These graphic and artistic works, created by both professional artists and untrained amateurs, were frequently quite large, measuring in some cases as much as 20 feet long or 7 feet tall. On the screen now is a chart by George Weston entitled "The Mission and Atonement of Christ," which dates from about 1920. Although time does not permit an extended analysis, I will point out that this image compares the standard Protestant vision on the right of heaven above, the earth, and hell below, with a multi-tiered Mormon afterlife with multiple kingdoms of glory, including celestial glory, terrestrial glory, telestial glory, and total darkness. This untitled preaching chart by an unknown artist seems to date from around the Second World War, based upon its depiction on the right-hand side of airplanes bombing cities. It measures 16 feet 7 inches wide by 2 feet 5 inches tall, and also includes standard Christian prophetic imagery from both the Old Testament and the New Testaments of the Bible, including the Colossus of Nebuchadnezzar from the book of Daniel on the far left, the number 1260 in the lower margin, and the whore, or harlot of Babylon, in the center, riding on a multi-headed beast while drinking from a chalice of abominations, an image taken from the book of Revelations. My presentation, which I position within David Howlett's category of restorationist studies, responds to historian Mark A. Shearer's 2011 call to include analysis of preaching charts in expanding the history of the reorganized church. David Morgan, a leading scholar of American religious images, has shown that the study of material and visual culture is central to understanding lived religion. Objects and images are constitutive of the construction of social reality that defines religious experience. Paintings are not merely illustrations of theology or ecclesiastical pronouncements. Rather, they are primary documents of the construction and communication of the symbolic universes which individuals inhabit. Studying the material culture of religion provides a fuller understanding of how believers experience their faith than can be garnered from written sources alone. By drawing on documentary research, church publications, photographic evidence, and more than 100 preaching charts held by the Community of Christ archives and also in private collections, in my limited time this afternoon, I offer a history and typology of this unstudied genre of American visual culture. I argue that between 1880 and 1950, preaching charts influenced by Adventist prophetic paintings and created without official direction or administrative supervision can be understood as falling into particular categories recognized by members of the church at the time. Before proceeding, I want to acknowledge my indebtedness to a number of individuals within the Community of Christ, the successor to the RLDS. Today's presentation would not have been possible without the generous assistance and involvement of Rachel Killebrew, the librarian and archivist of the Community of Christ, Barbara Walden, the executive director of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, and Lachlan Mackay, the apostle of the Community of Christ Council of 12. They have been exceptionally hospitable and helpful to this scholar inquiring from outside the faith. The wonderful photographs of these artworks that I'll be showing you today were created by the talented Valerie Anderson of Kansas City, Missouri. Unless I indicate otherwise, the charts in this presentation are currently held by the Library and Archive of the Community of Christ. The reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was one of 6 historical branches of Mormonism identified by the scholar Massimo Intravine, which developed after the prophet Joseph Smith was killed in 1844. To dilute the historiographical emphasis upon the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, headquartered in Salt Lake City, sociologist Crystal Vanell refers to these branches as the 6 historical Mormonisms, thus recognizing theological and organizational multiplicity within the Mormon faith tradition. After Smith's death, a number of congregations of his followers banded together in June of 1852. In 1860, Joseph Smith III, the son of the prophet, accepted the presidency of this group, which was located primarily in Illinois and Wisconsin, claimed to be the only true Mormon church, and in 1872 dubbed itself the Reorganized Church. With Emma Hale Smith, the prophet's widow and the mother of the group's president, taking an important role in the organization, the RLDS Church decried polygamy, claiming that Brigham Young had introduced the heresy and Joseph Smith Jr. had not participated in it. The RLDS Church believed in conversion, baptism, and committed discipleship. Through active missionary work and evangelism, the church, composed almost exclusively of Americans of European heritage, diffused throughout the Midwest, the Pacific and Mountain West, Canada, and the Northeast, eventually spreading globally. By Joseph Smith III's death in 1914, church membership numbered 70,000. Although largely eschewing communal ownership of property, the RLDS Church believed that discipleship was most fully possible when practiced within a community of believers. Church members were expected to tithe, and historically there's been a tendency for believers to gather into Zion, first in Lamoni, Iowa, and subsequently Independence, Missouri. Scholars, including David Howlett, have argued that the RLDS practiced a quote-unquote moderate Mormonism, and that the theology and praxis of the denomination evolved separately from other branches of the church and in relation to surrounding Protestant religious practices, becoming over time less secretive and increasingly focused on temple ceremonies. The creation and use of preaching charts appears to be one of the factors that differentiate the LDS from the other Mormonisms. The RLDS adapted their use of preaching charts from other Protestant denominations, most specifically the Adventists. In the second half of the 19th century, itinerant Adventist preachers carried large painted charts with them throughout the United States to assist in explaining how the Bible predicted the imminent return of Christ. This example, owned by the Shelburne Museum, is representative, measures approximately 22 feet long by 4 feet tall, and features Nebuchadnezzar's Colossus on the left and the Whore of Babylon on her mount on the right. The exaggerated size of these canvases allowed evangelists to address expansive audiences, while the combination of images and text mediated between the pedagogical potential of imagery and the traditional Protestant reliance upon the written and preached word. In December 1873, the True Latter-day Saints Herald, a publication of the RLDS Church, edited by Joseph Smith III himself, reprinted a description of a similar Adventist chart that originally appeared in the Boston Globe within an account of an Adventist meeting in Connecticut. The Herald reported, above the pulpit hung a chart filled with prophetic typical pictures and numbers, all the symbolic creatures of Daniel's vision and many of the symbolisms of Revelation, including the scarlet-robed woman riding on the beast with 7 heads and carrying the cup of her filthiness and abominations in her hand, and the typical figures of 1335 and 1260, end quote. Again, that's a quote taken from the True Latter-day Saints Herald describing an Adventist chart, not this one, but an example of the genre. RLDS preachers embraced the use of visual aids, such as their denominational newsletter had described. In 1891, D.S. Crawley reported from Ware Canvas that, quote, "For 2 years back, I have often used an Advent chart of the image of Daniel 2nd, etc., and find it very useful in assisting in tracing out fulfillment of prophecies and attracting general attention," end quote. Around 1890, RLDS elders began to fashion their own charts. In 1894, in El Dorado, Missouri, I.N. White used a chart which a witness described as being, quote, "of his own make," end quote, to address a large audience. This work depicted, quote, "the various dispensations, Adam, Noah, Moses, Christ, and the present one. Adam represented the time in the parable known as the early in the morning, Noah about the 3rd hour, Christ about the 9th hour, Joseph Smith about the 11th hour." Now, unfortunately, because individuals like White conceived of themselves as preachers rather than as artists, most RLDS preaching charts are unsigned and undated. However, this unattributed chart follows the basic outline of White's chart of 1894. Unlike the Adventist timeline, which culminated with Christ's return, in this typical RLDS chart, biblical prophecy is fulfilled with Joseph Smith's revelations and his subsequent new 5th dispensation. In these 2 details, you can see that the artist used the 1260 years derived from the book of Revelations and associated with the harlot of Babylon on the left to arrive at 1830, the date of Joseph Smith's new dispensation. On the right, Joseph Smith the elder kneels at the base of the hill Cumorah to envision messengers who allow him to found the church, which is bathed in glory. In the lower right of this detail, one can make out an inventory of misguided Protestant reformers identified by their initials, stretching back from William Miller through Alexander Campbell and John Calvin all the way to Martin Luther. In 1894, in Ardoise, Nova Scotia, Canada, the evangelist J.J. Davidson used a chart described as covering, quote, 37 square feet, and which must have taken time and labor physically and mentally to produce, end quote. A witness reported that this chart enabled the speaker, quote, to show people just what he was talking about, end quote. Similarly, in the same year, a correspondent to the Saints Herald reported that Elder H.J. Davison's chart, quote, enabled the matter to be put so plainly that a child could easily understand it, end quote. Now, not every RLDS evangelist had the artistic talent or the impulse to use images to illustrate their sermons. Some put their faith in simply the presentation of the word. This example, which can be dated to approximately 1920 because of references to Heber J. Grant, the 7th president of the Utah LDS Church, lays out the 5 dispensations of the church while simultaneously condemning polygamy in all ages. Again, this chart notes the 1260 years of darkness within the Christian age and enumerates the failed theologians who predated Joseph Smith. RLDS ministers apparently frequently created their own preaching charts, including the aforementioned I.N. White, J.J. Davidson, H.J. Davison, and others such as George M. Shippey, E.O. Clark, and J.J. Cornish of Saskatchewan. Other evangelists, however, commissioned their visual aids from artists. In 1905, Ernest Webby of Collinwood, Ohio, offered that he was willing to create charts with proceeds going to the Cleveland branch of the church. On a more commercial level, in 1898, the firm of Holmes and Kress offered, quote, scriptural and Book of Mormon subjects illustrated by finely painted pictures and charts furnished on muslin, canvas, or oilcloth, end quote. Based in Kansas City, Holmes and Kress primarily specialized in commercial signs and billboards. George F. Weston, who you see here on the left of the screen, is the most noteworthy creator of RLDS preaching charts. Born in Reynolds Basin, New York in 1857, he grew up in Buchanan, Michigan. Upon reaching adulthood, he pursued a career as an artist, creating maps, patent drawings, and portraits of his neighbors' homes. He embraced the teachings of the RLDS Church in the 1870s and was ordained in 1879 in Plano, Illinois, before conducting missionary work in southern Indiana. In the 1890s, Weston developed maps illustrating the location of events from the Book of Mormon in North and South America. He advertised in the Saints Herald that these maps would be useful in missionary work and sold soft copies that could be folded easily for itinerants and varnished copies that could be framed and hung in churches and meeting halls. And on the right, Elder Frederick Brackenbury is captured preaching before one of Weston's maps. In 1903, Weston and his wife were gathered into Independence, Missouri, where he practiced both his faith and a business based on religious imagery. Weston's preaching charts fit firmly into the larger genre, but stand out for being colorful, graphically appealing, and characterized by sophisticated compositions and execution. This prophecy chart clearly conveys an interpretation of Daniel's dream of Nebuchadnezzar's Colossus, while also demonstrating how the prophecy culminated in 1830 with Moroni revealing the golden tablets. Weston's works also demonstrate an awareness of his role as an artist and of the charts as works of art and as commercial products. Weston took pride in his output and both signed his works and provided his location in Independence so that clients could contact him. He also regularly inscribed his works, copies furnished, to let the world know that he was willing to produce additional charts. He also was aware that itinerant missionary work could damage his paintings, so included instructions to, quote, keep this chart dry. Weston created this astounding and misogynistic work for Elder Daniel McGregor of Oyen, Alberta, Canada, an influential conservative voice within the denomination. Weston once again is addressing the 1260 years during which the Christian church was supposedly lost in the wilderness in advance of Smith's new dispensation. By the late 19-teens, a market had developed within the church for previously owned examples of Weston's works. The RLDS church hierarchy was supportive of the use of preaching charts and even made suggestions for possible graphics in the Saints Herald, such as this one. However, the leadership never attempted to regulate or control the content, production, or design of these works. Yet a typology can be proposed based upon extant examples and also on how charts were conceived in the written records. These works can be grouped into the following preliminary categories. Path of salvation charts illustrate the results of either following the gospel and ascending to the kingdoms of glory, or sinning and ending in the lake of fire and brimstone. This theme was developed by a range of artists, but Weston's many variants of his composition, entitled The Two Ways, represents the fullest articulation of the genre. RLDS preachers at the beginning of the 20th century noted that this variety of chart was particularly fruitful for converting Native Americans. Dispensation charts explain biblical history by placing Joseph Smith within a lineage of prophets and argue that his new dispensation of 1830 ushered in the 11th hour before the millennium. You saw other examples of this genre earlier, and this undated example by George Weston also illustrates on the right the alternative paths to the afterlife. Prophecy charts provide support for exegesis of the prophetic images in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations, frequently focusing on the Colossus of Nebuchadnezzar. I have shown a couple of these previously. This example, part of a set of charts commissioned by Willard Newman of Bridgeport, Connecticut in 1922, may have been created by a commercial sign painter in Connecticut. The final category contains a variety of charts addressing doctrinal issues and practices such as tithing and baptism. These canvases were created not to convert non-believers or locate the RLDS within biblical or religious history, but rather to educate individuals about their responsibilities as members of the flock. This work from the middle decades of the 20th century, for example, argues that the practice of tithing, including filling out forms to calculate appropriate donations, provides the path to the promised peaceable kingdom while curbing the horrors of income inequality and global strife. So in today's limited time, I hope that I have offered an introductory history and preliminary typology of these artworks produced and used within the RLDS Church between 1880 and 1950. In this period, they were created by both ministers and professional artists and were influenced by Adventist precedents. Although not regulated, sanctioned, or administered by the church leadership, these charts can be understood as falling within the four categories of path of salvation charts, dispensation charts, prophecy charts, and doctrinal charts. Thank you for your attention, and I will welcome your comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it's just been a privilege to listen to the presentations. It's time now for our question and answers. And so if we are ready, let's start with the first one. And that would be from Joanne Kelty. How did the RLDS women in the priesthood, in the Stragnite Church and the Rigonite Church, also, how about Sally Shumway, ordained by Gladden Bishop in the Voree in 1847? So do we have someone to address that, Nancy? Do you have that, or?
Yeah, I don't know how RLDS women handled, or how women's ordination was handled or perceived by RLDS women in either the Strangite or the Rigdonite churches. But there was an early rogue ordination, which the longer version of this paper includes in the RLDS church in the later 19th century. And, you know, that was dismissed by I believe the issue was dismissed by the relevant apostle over the field. I think that might have happened in Oregon. I don't have the information right in front of me, but we do have at least one case of a rogue ordination in the RLDS church where someone used justification of being moved by the Spirit and then ordained the woman in question.
Thank you very much. Catherine Pollock said, Nancy, whoa, my screen just moved. Just a minute. Nancy, have you done any research into what people think are the reasons that ordained women are such a lower percentage than men in denominations that ordain women?
Yes, there's a lot of sociological research in this area, and it shows that women generally receive much less support in the whole process of understanding call and of actually making their way to seminary in most mainline traditions, right? People need to go in order to be ordained. They have to go to seminary and they have to get like an MDiv. And from what I have seen and read of sociological research, women receive a lot less support, both emotional support or psychological support and financial support from maybe their congregations to do that. And women are more likely to be to maybe discover a call or begin to sense a call when they are, in a denomination that does not ordain women, where men are never in denominations that don't ordain men. So there's often, these pipelines look very different for men and women.
Well stated. Lee, I apologize, I cannot pronounce your last name, but asked of Jacquie, and that would also be Vicki, said that I'm interested in the logo and the artwork behind you. It seems to be the same as the ones used by Women's Caucus in the Church of the Brethren for the newsletter. Do you know of the origin of the graphic?
This graphic was used a lot in the Americas during that period, a lot of women's group, but it's peace and a woman's symbol. This is the idea of women, and this is the dove of peace.
And the cross.
And the cross, yeah.
And the cross.
So yeah, this was not just, made up by them. And the poster itself it's a blow up version of what was posted in all the bathrooms in the auditorium before the international gathering in the school. That's your question.
Well, thank you very much. Now, Catherine Pollock asks, William, how did you get interested in studying RLDS preaching charts?
Well, I did what scholars do, right? That you're interested in a topic. I'm interested in the visual culture of American religion. I'm interested in Adventist charts, and then through book research, I found that picture of the preacher in front of the map, and then I reached out to the librarian and the archivist, Rachel Killebrew, and at the Community of Christ. I said, do you have any paintings in your archive? And she said, well, I think we may have 6 or 8 or maybe a dozen that have come to us. So I scheduled an appointment to go to Independence, and as Rachel kept pulling things out of the back, it ended up we had more than 100 of them. And then I worked with her to get them photographed, so that we now have photographs of them, because they've never been cataloged or photographed. And then I've also been working with Barbara to find other examples that are owned by the descendants of the missionaries and itinerants that had them. So I'm just so excited to find this wonderful resource, this wonderful aspect of American visual culture that hasn't been studied and hasn't gotten the respect and the appreciation that it should. And particularly finding George Weston, who I think is the Michelangelo of the RLDS, I think.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And then Myra Elliott says, William, have you studied any Book of Mormon charts?
Well, I've spoken I'm not sure what you mean by Book of Mormon charts. I have spoken to my contacts in the history department at the Latter-day Saints and at Brigham Young University, and they have told me that they've never seen anything like that. That they think that it's a RLDS tradition rather than an LDS tradition, which I think is very interesting. And I'm hoping that what this will move towards is kind of expanding that idea of multiple Mormonisms, that the LDS Church does not define the movement, that the movement's broader than just what comes out of Utah. And I think it's wonderful to have this visual culture manifestation of the broader restoration.
Okay, Russ Osmond says, teaching chart comparisons with those of Christian Missionary Alliance and RLDS in Third World, ?
Well, part of what I was talking about with the secondary market for the George Weston preaching charts is that, again, in the Saints Herald in the 1920s and 1930s, there are people that are doing missionary work outside of the United States, and they're asking people to send them. If you no longer need your preaching charts, please send them to us and we can use them in the Philippines and so forth. But again, the thing that I found really amazing about this is that these really seem to be a grassroots, bottom-up, democratic form, that they're not having topics and images handed down from the church headquarters. It's not like there's a warehouse of these that are being managed by the church. They're being developed by the preachers themselves or by artists that are being commissioned by the preachers to represent their idea of the theology of the denomination rather than the church leadership's idea of the theology of the church.
And William, there's another question, a statement actually from Myra Elliott. She said there is a chart in the Joseph Smith Historic Site Library. So I think she just wanted to make sure you were aware of that.
Thank you.
Let's see if we have more questions there. And another one from Michael Riggs. Nancy, have you done any research on early Cutlerite women priesthood holders?
No, I have not, but it seems like in other branches of the Mormon movement or the Latter-day Saint movement, we do have some limited examples of women being ordained. And I guess I am now more curious about that, but I do not know.
Excellent. I think we need to draw our questions to a close. It's been a privilege to be in your presence and to listen to these presentations. I want to thank you ever so much. And thank you, Nancy, Vicki, William, for your presentations. And thank you to everyone for attending session 203. 204 will begin in about 15 minutes. I also want to give a special thank you for the sponsors of this session. And so a thank you to the University of Illinois Press for sponsoring this session. So just a reminder that it is recorded, and look forward to seeing you all in future sessions. Thank you.